So if you're looking at these models, the virus models, and you say to yourself, hey, these models are all broken and defective because they did not predict the future accurately, then you don't understand what a model is, because they're not designed to predict the future. They can't. It's not a thing. Nobody would try to design a model to predict the future, because you know in advance it's not a thing. It's not a thing. So you're wondering, well, why is everybody acting like it is a thing? I mean, literally everybody is acting like the models should have told us what the future looks like. And they didn't. So something's wrong, right? No, models are not intended to predict the future. Here's what they're for: persuasion and rough sizing of a problem. Did the models roughly size the problem? And here, the size can be very approximate, because all you're trying to do is persuade people to act differently to get that number lower. So did it size the problem as a big old problem that you should treat as a special problem? I'd say yes. What about the complaint that the models are completely broken and corrupt and wrong, and we made all the wrong decisions because the models were so flawed? One of the people getting a lot of attention for that point of view is ex-New York Times writer Alex Berenson. And a number of you had been asking me, what about that guy that he's saying? And he's saying that we've made this drastic change to shut down the economy, but it's based on modeling that doesn't line up with the realities. So he's saying that the models are not showing to be correct, and therefore it was a giant mistake to use the models to make decisions. But here's what Alex Berenson and almost all of the rest of the public does not understand, unless they watched me last night on my Periscope. Prediction models are not designed to predict anything. If you thought they were, you would agree with Alex Berenson, and you would agree with all of the people who said, hey, you predicted it would be this, it's way off, and you've already changed your prediction from 100,000 worst case to 60,000, and those are not really that close. So therefore your model was always wrong, and you've proved it by changing it so much, all the way down to 60,000 deaths. Obvious, right? If you said 100,000, but now you've revised it to 60, well, clearly the 100,000 was totally wrong, right? Because 60,000 and 100,000 are not really very close. Common sense, right? Wrong. And now watch me blow your mind. It's a little thing called context. So when we saw the original estimates, there was one curve that said if you do no mitigation, maybe 1 million at one point. There was some model that said 2 million, but I think we fairly quickly got to 1 million people dying at the high end in the United States. The low number with mitigation was 100,000 originally. Not originally, but for a while. And then more recently it dropped to 60,000. Here's the context you're missing. If you consider the gigantic range of uncertainty, is 60,000 and 100,000 really different? It really isn't. They're practically the same number, if you consider the wide range. Now, I get that both of these are with mitigation. But do you think there's anybody in the world who knows how to model mitigation in the United States? It's never been done. How could you possibly model mitigation? You don't know how well people are going to do it. You don't know, if it's different in different places. You don't know if there's a cultural problem. You don't know if people keep with it. You don't know if they're washing their hands too. I mean, how could you possibly model this? I mean, seriously. If you could get this close with mitigation and say, look, we said it'd be 100,000, but you came out at 60,000. Is that a mistake? No. If you've done modeling for a living, as I have, and by the way, ask anybody else who has ever done modeling for a living. If this were the outcome, you had predicted 100 at the low end, but we did good mitigation and it came in at 60, would you tell your boss that you missed it and you were completely wrong and I quit because it's so embarrassing, I was so far off? No. You would go in and tell your boss you needed a raise. Because out of all these possibilities, you said, with mitigation, we're going to be about here, and you got pretty darn close. You got pretty close. I'd call that a home run. That is as good as a model can be. Here's the kill shot on my point. Nobody in the world can predict the future with a complicated model with lots of variables during the fog of war. Now, you can sometimes predict how things will go if the thing that's going to happen is very, very similar to a thing that happened before and the thing that happened before and before. So I've used the example, let's say you're a home builder. And you build one home and you say, oh, it cost me this much per square foot. Then you build a second one, it's a different home, but the square footage comes out about the same cost. And then you build the third one. Do you think you could make a good estimate of your square footage cost for the third one? The answer is probably. Yeah, you'd have comparable things you could look at. Say, yeah, it's a lot like those other ones, so I'll use the same process. Yeah, you could get pretty close. But if you're in the fog of war, let's say the first week of the Iraq War. In the first week of the Iraq War, were there any modelers who could put in their variables and tell you how it was all going to come out? Of course not. Of course not. In the fog of war, you can't make any kind of a model that predicts the future. That's not a thing. Nobody's ever been able to do that. There's no model that can do that. There's no model that'll ever be able to do that. It's not logically possible. And if you're still wondering if there are some people who can make models and predict the future and a chaos, you think those people exist? Here's how you could spot them if they exist. They would be living on their trillion-dollar yachts. If anybody could build a model to accurately, or even more accurate than randomness, predict the future based on the chaos of the fog of war of any situation, whether it's this one or some other, if anybody could do that, they would be a trillionaire. Because it isn't something that can be done. So, if you say, Scott, your prediction model was wrong because it was not accurate, then I say to you, hey you, apparently you don't know what a prediction model is, because you thought it was for predicting. It isn't. The reason it's not designed to predict is because it can't. It's not a thing. It's just not a thing. You can't do what's not a thing, by analogy, because I know you like analogies. I do this sometimes just to annoy. If you had a bicycle, and your bicycle could not fly, it could only pedal on the ground, would you say that bicycle is broken? That bicycle is a piece of garbage because it can't fly. No, you would not. You would say, no, that doesn't make sense. You're not evaluating it as an airplane. A bicycle is intended to pedal on a road, so let's evaluate it for pedaling on a road. Oh, okay, it looks pretty good if you look at it that way. So if you're looking at these models, the virus models, and you say to yourself, hey, these models are all broken and defective because they did not predict the future accurately, then you don't understand what a model is, because they're not designed to predict the future. They can't. It's not a thing. Nobody would try to design a model to predict the future because you know in advance it's not a thing. It's not a thing. So you're wondering, well, why is everybody acting like it is a thing? I mean, literally everybody is acting like the models should have told us what the future looks like. And they didn't. So something's wrong, right? No, models are not intended to predict the future. Here's what they're for: persuasion and rough sizing of a problem. Did the models roughly size the problem? And here, the size can be very approximate, because all you're trying to do is persuade people to act differently to get that number lower. So did it size the problem as a big old problem that you should treat as a special problem? I'd say yes. The New York City numbers seem to indicate that the degree of panic about this was probably well warranted, because even with mitigation, they lost 7,000 people. And if you extended that to the whole country and imagined no mitigation, it could be 500,000 people, just based on what we do know. So, was it appropriate to use prediction models to persuade us to act differently, and also sized it as a big old problem that we don't know if it's 1 million or 100,000, but let me tell you, it's a big old problem if you don't do anything about it? I would say the models not only were useful and good, but some of the best of all time. Because missing the bottom number by that little when you did mitigation is pretty darn good. And if it did what it was supposed to do, which is persuade us to act differently, did it do that? Yeah. Yeah, those models persuaded me. I'll bet it persuaded most of you too. And did it size the general size? I think yes. Now, your critics will say no, that that's exactly the problem. It did not size the problem correctly. It missed the size of the problem by a mile. Did it? Did it? Because that doesn't look like a mile to me. That looks like, of all the possibilities, and of course that's mitigation, no mitigation versus mitigation, but if you could come that close with this level of uncertainty, I'm pretty impressed. I'm totally impressed. This would be a world-class. If it turns out that 60 is a real number, I actually think it's going to be lower. If it goes down to 30, then I'm going to join the chorus of people saying, these models maybe not as helpful as they could have been. But at 60, it's sort of a rounding error.